Hey guys, it's Paul, combat veteran, MMA fighter, YouTuber, and caffeine addict with a Space Marine mug. And today we are checking out a member requested video. For those of you that don't know, the channel now has memberships, which grant you access to the Discord, or exclusive rooms rather, on the Discord. It grants you priority access to party with me when I stream multiplayer games, and most importantly, lets you submit and vote on my Friday reaction video. This is extra good because there are literally only 2 members. So right now it consists of me posting to the members only YouTube, and they tell me what they want me to do. So it's a pretty good deal. Plus, it helps me support it helps support me and by extension the channel. Okay, guys. Having done that, we are checking out the Vostroyan Firstborn Regiments of Distinction. Oh no! It's copyrighted music. My nemesis.
The tales of the grim darkness of the far future are varied and always without hope. For that, hope is now a thing of the past, or so everyone thought.
I mean, it's not a thing of the past, you know. The Custodes hope the Emperor comes back. That's hope. Though, I guess there's not really a scenario that happens. The Ultramarines hoped Robert Guilliman came back, and he did.
The golden age of humanity gone, our grandeur, our zenith reached, and then escaping us so long, long ago. Even when we were on the pathway to recovery, to a return to logic and science and enlightenment, the domination of our galaxy, the forces of the universe could not permit that to happen. And so the greatest civil war of our race's history, the Horus Heresy, was unleashed upon us.
I mean, okay. The war against the AI, the Man of Iron, that may count as a civil war, right? Because, you know, they were both part of the Empire of Humanity, or the early Human Federation. It just happened that some of them... But I guess machines don't get to count as people. But you don't have to be a person to be a part of people's empire, right? There's non-Tau part of the Tau Empire. But I guess it's a technical distinction. But I would argue that were there people on the side of the machines in the Age of Strife? I don't know. It's a question mark.
Us by the dark powers of chaos and their terrible twisted gods.
I love how Baltimore is one really dramatic, but also always reminds us of the setting of Warhammer 40k at the start of every video.
And in those days, were the seeds sown for the stage we are now to peruse.
Man, I appreciate that he uploads these in beautiful 4K, because this 1080p is just like, it's like I'm there. It's like those Grey Knight Terminators are lighting me on fire.
The very genesis of the army, the regiments, that has seen endless war in every corner of the human realm, the Imperium of...
they're Space Marines from... They look like Horus Heresy era, actually.
Man, since its inception. For some say that the return of the Avenging Sun, the Primarch of the Ultramarines and son of the Emperor himself, Reboot Guilliman,
I thought it was Robute? That was Robute.
Has brought that one element back into the galaxy, into the universe. A shining light, thought never to rise again. Hope. But for the people of Vostroyan, the home world of the Firstborn, this can...
That is a Russian Imperial mustache if there ever was one.
...not be. For it was none other than Reboot himself who passed judgment on them, on their world, on its people, on its past, and he found them wanting.
You think I am blind to the slightest perfidy, the meanest transgression, despite that I run the entire Imperium, while my brother prosecute the scouring of the traitors from existence? That I...
Okay, this Robert Guilliman voice is great.
Robot Gilliman,
He keeps calling him Rowboat. Is that what he's doing?
Primarch of the Ultramarines and Lord Commander of the Imperium, would overlook such craven acts? Your Emperor called for aid. Your people needed you, and you did not answer the call. For this, you may never be forgiven. Your penance may never end. But you...
Okay, well, alright. There's this... So, this, like, passing judgment on a people thing that seems to be really, really common in Warhammer 40k lore, that, like, we've just accepted it as, like, morally good, right? We've just decided that, yes, if a world, for example, like Krieg, right, chooses to rebel, then all of their children and descendants all the way through time will forever have to pay the price for that. And while that's sort of true sometimes in the natural world, right? For example, if we pollute a lake, then our children and our children's children will have to deal with that. Or if we, cook the planet, that's going to be future generations' problem. So in some ways, the natural world does have that, but in other ways it doesn't. For example, if my parent were to, let's say, commit a crime, right, or to injure themselves, right, you as their offspring would not inherit that injury, right? You would get a fresh start, a fresh chance. So, yeah, this idea that, like, in terms of morality, you can pass judgment on an entire planet is sort of facetious, especially when so in order to do wrong, you have to have the option to do right. For example, it's not wrong to breathe oxygen, right? Like, because even if it were somehow proven to be harmful for me to breathe in oxygen and expel carbon dioxide, I don't have a choice. I don't have the ability to switch it up and expel oxygen and breathe in carbon dioxide, right? And so you have to have a choice between good and evil for you to do evil, right? And so for the vast majority of people on a planet, they don't have a choice, right? Their leaders dictate what they can do, and then they are subject to it, right? In some ways, they are victims of it. I assume that every person on Vostroya didn't have their own personal spaceship and got to make a positive or negative choice whether to aid the Emperor. Of course, that's not the case, right? So to sit there and say, okay, you people, regular people who never had a choice as to what happens to you, you will be judged one way or another, is ridiculous, right? It flies in the face of the basic understanding of morality, which is at its core choice, right? The ability to make a choice between two things. You get into even stranger questions when you say, what if you make the wrong choice, but the information that you have access to is limited, right? What happens when someone who is given incorrect information makes a morally correct choice based on that? That's when you get into weird things, for example, religion, where they say, oh, if you impose if you do this or that to this other person, then you will be, in fact, giving them a moral good. You'll be allowing them to, achieve enlightenment or ascend to heaven or whatever, when in fact that is, potentially incorrect. Then you get even more complicated because it's like, okay, are you performing a moral good because you believe that you are helping someone, or is it still, is there a universal, like, bad to it, right? This is the sort of complex morality questions that I assume you have completely resolved if you are a Primarch, because obviously the Emperor is the ultimate moral compass and has never made a mistake of fatherhood in his life.
You will be given the chance to make restitution, but it will not be easy. My judgment is thus. For it seems you loved your sons too much to send but one to war for your Emperor. So henceforth, every family of Vostroya, from highest to lowest, from each generation, will give unto the Imperium their firstborn son. and they shall be enlisted in regiments armed, equipped and trained by Vostroya. They will fight for the Emperor to remove the blemish from your name.
Yeah, imagine being 5,000 years in the past and being like, well, you have to understand, thousands of years ago, somebody fucked up, and so now you have to pay the price. But if we know one thing about human beings, it's that, man, people can hold a grudge. The best I don't have a favorite example of a grudge, right? Because it always ends so badly. But often you look at places like the Balkans where when you ask even like private individuals, right? Like not leaders or thought like thinkers, but just regular everyday workaday folks, you ask them about their rival ethnic group or religion or sect or linguistic group, and they will literally tell you a story dating back 700, 800, 900 years about how their ancestors how the other person's ancestors wronged their ancestors, and that things have spilled down in a tit-for-tat for 800 years, leading to whatever horrible things have happened most recently. It's pretty wild, honestly, that human beings are capable of that, but certainly has a precedent in history.
And thus he gave unto them a sentence that they still serve 10,000 years later. A curse they can never be free of, yet they can barely remember the reason for its passing, are not permitted to understand even its genesis. But do not worry, for all shall be revealed. For there to be understanding, there must be context, and it is now that I ask you to come with me on a journey that ends 10,000 years or more later, in the current years of the age of the Imperium, more specifically, the age Indomitus, and begins before the reign of blood, before the Black Crusades, before...
Oh, man. Whew. This is Warhammer 40k, right? This is like that meme of that guy in a baseball game who's turning and facing his girlfriend and being like, I assume girlfriend, maybe first date, and she looks like she wants no part of anything he's saying, but he is enthusiastically explaining to her. And the caption is always like, so Warhammer 40k is about the Imperium, but this guy, the Emperor, who, made these Primarchs, but the Primarchs, you got to understand the warp, and to understand the warp, you got to understand that 8,000 years ago, the Emperor was born in Anatolia, right? This is how, by the way, you remain single forever.
The heresy before the Great Crusade, and the earliest birth of the Imperium. I ask you to join me as we go all the way back to the
Alright, we're joining you, man. Let's just do it.
Time period humanity has ever endured. The Age of Strife. Welcome to the tale of one of the most legendary standard human military organizations known to the Imperium. Welcome to the tale of the Vostroyan Firstborn.
Okay. Oh my god, cinematics. Oh, wait. Oh, man. Okay, well, this is sick. Baltimore's guys. Roar with passion. That's true. That's a fact. Da 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 da. Gonna get copyright claimed. Da da da. Oh my god, if I have to hear about the Emperor's birth for the 15th time, I'm gonna have to skip ahead, guys.
So, we begin our journey.
Oh god, please.
From the time period we now exist in, the present, humanity went out into the stars, slowly at first, with sublight speed and great cost.
God damn it. Baltimore, I can't deal with this. I've heard the origin of humanity story 15 times. I'm so sorry, guys. I have to...
that would house entire populations. For when humanity discerned the darkness that dwelt, found many to be potential allies, trade partners, almost teachers as well. But there were those with whom we immediately found were narcissistic spiral into self-destruction.
Yep.
The men of iron escalating their own technology defeated. Their spectre still challenging, but combined, they spelled the end of the human hegemony. The Imperium became troubled, stormed the dimension, the Imperium. They used them as gateways into our reality.
Oh my God, we've only made it to chaos in the Age of Strife. Jeez.
And thus the Imperium was renamed the Warp. We were nearly exterminated. The beasts of Mars would send out exploration fleets, carrying all they would need to form new forge worlds, as humanity did of old. And it was into the region that was home to Vostroyan that one of these rare fleets
Oh my God, we're okay. All right, guys, we're here. We're gonna learn something unique.
arrived. Being technologically advanced, organized, and appearing competent, the people of the world of Vostroyan swore fealty to these newcomers. The Mechanicum. The exploratory fleet of the Mechanicum soon dominated the people of Vostroya as much as assisted them. But Vostroya was not seen as large or minerally rich enough a planet to be remade into a forge world proper. So the tech priests of the Mechanicum reinvigorated the production capacity of the world. But, as always, they did not teach. They would not permit others to know the secrets of their technological knowledge, but ingrained in the humans of Vostroya something of their perspectives. On Earth, now named Terra, the master of mankind, the Emperor, arose. He unified the cradle of humanity and bloodying.
Okay, so here is what is sort of interesting is when you look at human beings' colonial history, one, not all colonial relationships are created equal. And this is based on, obviously, a whole host of factors. So there was a Spanish model of colonialism, and generally the way that would work is that it was in service of mercantilism. The explorers that were effectively agents of the government were commissioned to, and they were military members generally, would be commissioned to go to the New World, right, the Americas, and they would, and other regions, but you know, you saw it classically in the Americas is the best example, and they would engage in, had a mandate just to seek profit, right, to seek transportable monetary goods that the Empire of Spain could use to fund its empire, its operations, right, to wage war on primarily Great Britain. And so they would have this extremely, frighteningly extractive economy. A Spanish would have a Spanish lord would have a holding of some sort, and they would either take the indigenous peoples as slaves wholesale, but they quickly learned that the thousands of years of barrier between their the indigenous people's immune systems and the European people's immune systems meant that a lot of diseases that Europeans were largely protected from would devastate indigenous people. So they learned that trading in slaves was not that profitable. So what they did instead is they would effectively take the indigenous people and they would force them to labor. Usually under some sort of 3 months of the year, you would provide X days of labor, or maybe a village would be required to provide so many males, so many days of labor per year. And they would work in mines, they would work building infrastructure, would work in ports, or would just simply be required to provide some sort of tribute or taxation. Again, this is entirely extractive, right? In contrast, the British seem to use a slightly different model. And for the British, right, in the Americas, for example, they actually were less about extraction and more about wealth and territorial expansion. So again, some of this involves who it was, right? The peoples that settled in the Americas were sometimes not always directly as profit-minded. They were either trying to stake claims on the hope that the simply ownership and defense of the regions would be profitable. Sometimes they were looking for resources that weren't really conducive to this large-scale extraction, such as fur trading. But the result was that their colonies, right, were more self-sustaining, right? They wanted to establish true hubs of trade and commerce, including a lot of self-governance, right? That's one of the things that's really different in terms of the origin of former Spanish and Portuguese colonies versus, colonial colonies, or I'm sorry, American British colonies, was that there was a lot more infrastructure of self-governance. By self-governance, I of course mean governance of people that lived in the colonies, than you saw. And there's a little bit more investment in the sense of it was much more mature, much more well-developed, right? The Spanish system always sort of had this weird military vibe where it was just like someone was in charge and they gave orders and they were never to do more infrastructure development or more policy development than was absolutely necessary to extract gold and silver from the New World. You also had some sort of other relationships where, like, the Portuguese would establish and Dutch would establish, like, actual trading hubs. Like, that was the point. The point was to be able to dock a ship in a port, exchange with the native people, and get out, right? Each one of them had their flaws and had their advantages for the empires that did them, and even for the peoples that were subject to colonialism, right? While it's an umbrella of exploitation, right? Nobody's arguing for the goodness of it here, right? But that said, exploitation can take a lot of forms, and again, the Spanish were just viciously brutal in terms of forced labor, forced exploitation. The English model had a bit less forcible death, killing, and other sort of wrongdoing on the indigenous people, but there was a lot more cultural sort of colonialism, right? So all this to say is that Warhammer 40k sort of also is illustrating this in that you have lots and lots of relationships between the Imperium and planets, right? There are planets where the Imperium simply shows up and says, you pay taxes to us now, right? And then there's some worlds where they say, we are going to remake your entire world from the ground up. There's some worlds where they say, we are going to share everything with you and make you a true full-fledged member of the Imperium. And there's worlds where they come in and say, no, we are in possession of forbidden knowledge we will never share. So it may not make sense to us, but in fact, it has precedent in history. That's the point of all this. And again, please don't think this giant rant where I talk about the important details of history is somehow endorsing the exploitive and bad system of colonialism. It was bad, right?
Engagement after bloody engagement with the use of his genetically engineered super soldiers, his Thunder Warriors, and later his Legiones Astartes, the legions of Space Marines. And it
Space Marines
was there he set out with his legions unto the stars to reconquer the galaxy. When the Great Crusade reached Vostroya, like all of the human worlds it encountered, the options given were two only: to join the Imperium of mankind and comply, or to die. Despite the influence of the Mechanicum, who were travelling with the forces of the Great Crusader's allies, the world of Vostroya was no forge world, and thus it fell firmly within the remit and control of the Imperium. It would always be influenced by Mars, but its masters were those under the Emperor himself. And the discovery of the people of Vostroya was a boon to the growing Imperium, as its production rate and skill were very high. Thus, it was designated as an industrial world. It would provide supplies and weapons of war for the new empire of mankind.
War, war, war. I always appreciate that, the fact that, like, despite there being a million worlds, right? And a million worlds, you could produce a lot of things, right? They surely need a great many things. So the idea that this centrally planned economy, every world is making, like, las guns or something, it always sort of sits weird with me, right? Honestly, the thing that we don't talk about is that there's not really supply chains at work here. Logically, there should be, right? There should be raw material worlds that harvest things, and then there should be, like, intermediate manufacturing worlds. For example, the modern equivalent would be someone's got to harvest iron ore, right? But then someone has to refine the iron ore. Someone else has to pour it into steel beams. Then someone else or steel ingots. Someone else has to shape it or press it into an appropriate shape. And then a final world will finish the manufacturing process by assembling all the components, the iron, the plastic, the wires, the copper, everything into a finished car. And in fact, in the modern system, it's not one factory, right? Because of the complicated system of tariffs and taxation in the world, you'll actually see things like an engine will be designed in Japan, the steel will be manufactured in China, the engine itself will be partially assembled in Mexico, the car parts will, the frame of the car will be assembled in Canada using Vietnamese steel, then they'll be shipped into the United States to be combined into an engine and frame, but then the whole unit will be shipped to Europe for paneling and the electronics, where it will be shipped back to combine with other components. It's insane, honestly, how incredibly complex modern like supply chains are, and some of that is again saving like tiny percentages on taxation, or to qualify, like in NAFTA, right? Manufacturing is required. A certain amount of the manufacturing process has to occur within the NAFTA zone, and so they try to meet those requirements as efficiently as possible given all the constraints that they're under. But it just looks like a mess, and it's always one of those things where when people are like, to prevent climate change, you have to eat just a third of a burger a week. I'm like, listen, how about, for starters, we stop shipping cars around the world 3 times just to make them? Like, can we just make them in, like, one factory, right? Like, we spend so much, and you can Google it, right? I'm not just some conspiracy theorist. You can Google how much carbon is used in the transportation industry and the construction industry, and you'll realize that consumer carbon footprint is trivial. It's insignificant compared to what happens on the industrial scale, often for no reason, right? I mean, look, last time you took a flight, how many times do you have, there's the cheapest flight, this wildly inefficient route that takes you to Chicago, then to Seattle, then finally to San Diego, right? That was a real flight that I took because it was cheaper. Yet somehow I traveled thousands of additional miles in an aircraft, and that was less expensive than just taking a more fuel efficient route. Anyway, rant complete.
And then the Horus Heresy came.
Bow.
Now we must discuss this issue more than we have done in the past, as it is important to know the situation to understand the actions that the Vostroyans took, for things are never as straightforward as one might immediately think.
Well, that's actually probably the true... The one thing that Warhammer 40k gets right about the world is everything makes sense in context. And I love the fact that Warhammer 40k, despite having an entire faction dedicated to not making any sense, i.e. chaos, they still have the most nuanced factions, of almost any sci-fi fantasy universe, right? Because they're not driven by just like, the orcs want to conquer the galaxy. Even 40k orcs, who are explicitly dumb and ridiculous, still have more nuance than like the stereotypical like Warcraft orcs,
But why?
But why?
Because the Imperium was based on a lie. The greatest lie of them all. The enforced doctrine of the Imperial Truth. The Imperial Truth was simple, yet so many resisted it, so many died rather than accept it. And it was as thus. There were no gods, no demons, no magic, no sentience behind every good or evil act, no omnipotent being sitting in judgment, no snake to lead humanity astray. No superstition, nothing to worship, and nothing that could not be explained through the lens of science and logic, if one were able to denote the time and effort and use the scientific method to discern the hidden truths of the universe. The things that might be seen in the warp were merely predatory beasts, nothing more. Certainly nothing to fear. Science could explain all. This was a doctrine that was to be accepted without exception from every single human in the galaxy. Any dissenting voices, any resistance to this stance was not met with explanation or patience, but with annihilation. A non...
I always appreciate that one, where, your idea is clearly right, and the scientific method, which requires being open to counter-argument and testing it against hypotheses, when the scientific method says you have to destroy your enemies, your ideological, those who differ from you ideologically, something important is lost. And I understand that there's an ideological point, right, where the scientific method, right, requires genuine inquiry, and it requires a basis, a baseline, where both parties agree. They have to agree that whatever the evidence says is what we're going to back up, right? Whatever the best evidence we have, we all agree that we are open to being persuaded. And the reality is, even among scientists, right, there's the saying that science advances one funeral at a time. It's because human beings are just powerless to let go of these ideas, right? They become emotionally invested, or their identity gets tangled up in these ideas. And once you reach a point where your identity, your fundamental conception of who you are is inexorably linked to an idea. This is, for example, every scientist who has a pet theory or a pet model, and they almost never let it go and say it was wrong. Especially, imagine, right? You've spent a decade, you've given talks, you've written books, you are the proponent of the XYZ model. And then one day, some Yahoo runs a study, and it turns out that your model cannot be true. It is incompatible with this study. Your mind is going to rationalize away why their study is wrong, why their evidence is wrong. And you don't even realize it, but you've crossed a Rubicon at some point where there was no evidence that someone could offer that would change your mind about your pet theory. All this to say that the scientific method having a caveat, or a scientific method-based way of thinking, having a caveat that says heterodoxy, or thinking ideas not already approved, must be destroyed, is counter to the fundamental idea of the scientific method, right? There has to be a way to say, hey, if you can show me this evidence, I can be persuaded, right? Even if your opponents cannot, right? Now, are there ideas that are so toxic that you just need to destroy them? That's a good question. It's tough to say. There may be doctrines that are so evil and so fundamentally wrong that you have to just get rid of them and remove them from your society. But I don't even know. I don't even know if I could name one that I think is so toxic that it can never be allowed to spread. There's definitely some. Yeah, there's definitely some. But it's tough to say. It's really tough, because it's like, who am I to decide who gets to live and die, right? Because there's some ideologies that are pretty horrible and pretty anathemic to modern values, but we just accept, right? A lot of, for example, small religious communities, right? Like cults. There's a lot of cults that believe some really toxic stuff, but because they sort of stay on their compounds in the desert, as a society, we just say, they can do their thing. Even if they're perpetuating harm on their members, right? There's some pretty horrible stories about, again, very small, very insular religious sects, doing some pretty horrible things, especially to children within their sects, SECT algorithm, not, oh God, I'm gonna get demonetized. But you know what I mean, right? As a society, we decide that those ideologies can exist as long as they don't try to exert themselves. So maybe it's ideologies with a expansion mandate that say it's not merely enough that we are permitted to exist, but that this ideology must be spread by force if necessary. Yeah, it's tough. That is, again, I don't know why this is the video of high moral debates and what is morality, but whatever. You guys should stick around, right? I'm sure it's only going to get weirder.
could stand before the forces of the Great Crusade. None could match the Space Marines, let alone their demigod fathers or the godlike Zeus, who led them all, the Emperor of mankind. But for all the protestations of this being, for all his reassurances, for all his wisdom, this proved to be an utter lie. All of it. The Horus Heresy. You see, things were not as clear-cut, as simple as people may presently believe. It simply wasn't. Due to the Imperial Truth. Due to the lie that the Emperor and his sons, who knew no better than to propagate this lie. For he did not even tell them, his sons, his generals, his Primarchs, of the actual truth. For what reason?
I didn't know that. I didn't know that in lore the Emperor never told the Primarchs about the existence of Chaos Gods.
We may never truly know, although there were many potentials. But that is definitely a speculation for another day. And from my reading of the lore, it created a form of background cognitive dissonance in all who considered the Imperial Truth, but had to witness not only the Emperor, but his Primarch sons and their superhuman warriors of the Legiones Astartes. It simply did not make sense. Not really. Because Titans were astride the galaxy. Titans. The leaders of...
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting chance to talk about cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is, of course, when you hold two conflicting beliefs. What happens is it creates in a person, if they recognize the beliefs are conflicting, it creates a huge amount of anxiety as they mentally try to reconcile those two beliefs, right? And it's almost impossible for them to do, right? You engage in this process called rationalization, where you try to fit two things that you really, really believe are true into you try to get them to both exist at the same time. And sometimes it results, of course, in like comically poor mental gymnastics. Oftentimes it can result in sort of strident extremism as people swing back and forth or come to the conclusion that the only way they can hold two beliefs is to completely remake their lives and the lives of everyone around them, right? And it's telling that human beings would literally rather fundamentally alter the character of their entire lives in the world than to simply decide that one of these two contradictory beliefs must be wrong. It's pretty. It'd be pretty funny if it didn't cause, untold human suffering.
Of the 20 Legiones Astartes had a being at their head, a genetically altered and enhanced being known as a Primarch, taken from the very genetic template of the Emperor himself. They were vast, abnormally intelligent, skilled.
Okay, I think I see where he's going with this. Let's just see if we could skip ahead. I know how the Primarchs work.
And capable. Each has a... It was as if nothing anyone said on either side could be believed. Or rebellion. The Emperor and Horus. Not really. For with the powers of the Primarchs able to wield propaganda, to coerce, to confuse, it was as if nothing anyone said on either side could be believed, let alone trusted. For the Loyalists expected people to go against everything that they had been told by the conqueror they knew only as the Emperor of mankind. And the trap of the Imperial Truth was sprung by the Chaos Guards. For how could anyone believe the truth, the reality? It all had to be some half-truth from the forces loyal to the Emperor. So they would always sound insane if they revealed the danger that Horus had fallen to the Dark Gods. But the Dark Gods did not exist according to the Imperial Truth. Could not exist. So the War Master, the most favoured and lauded son of the Emperor, had turned on him. He rebelled, stating the Emperor was trying to crush all of humanity under his boot as the worst despot of all time. And who could argue with this? Who?
We're going to learn about Horus.
For none would know the mind of the Emperor better than his greatest general and closest standard men and women. It looked bad. Awful. There was no way to know the truth. And none then worshipped the Emperor. So there was no religious zeal or fervour to explain it, to make certainty resound in the hearts of those who were asked to die in this cataclysmic confrontation between beings of power. And what could standard normal humans do in the face of gods that lied, either directly or about one another? It looked far more like a family spat that had gotten out of control. The true stakes could never be revealed.
This is actually a good point, right? Like, so one of the things that was commonly cited about the propaganda efforts of the Soviet Union was initially they tried to be like during the Second World War, right? They tried to paint a rosy face of bad situations, right? They would often underreport tactical losses or report losses as victories, or exaggerate the victories that occurred. But, of course, throughout the war, the level of casualties grew higher and higher and higher, and it became harder and harder for people to believe that there were continual victories, despite the fact that the food was getting more and more short, the list of casualties growing longer and longer, and despite the fact that the Red Army appeared to never be losing. And so the strategy slowly began to shift, and by the time the Second World War ended and the Iron Curtain fell in earnest, Soviet propaganda had transitioned to simply confusing people. And the goal was to say things that were either partially true, loosely true, or sort of unverifiable, right? And this was in part to ensure that people assumed that no possible truth, no possible set of facts was complete enough to be used to make a decision, right? This, of course, serves the exact same purpose as inspiring loyalty, right? Instead of being loyal to the state, you just don't know anything else, right? Like nothing else could inspire you to action because you don't know. The truth is impossible to discern. So if someone came to you in 1960s Russia and said, we are going to rebel against the Soviet machine, right? These people are oppressing us. We are not free. We cannot have free speech. They would say, well, how do you know it? And they'd say, well, look, you can't say these things. And they go, well, you can't say what, man? Like, we can't. You got to prove it, right? Like, what are you going to do? Who are you? You could be just, people assume that the person talking to them is just another liar, is just another autocrat who wants to take over and run the country into the ground like the Soviets with the same set of lies and truisms, right? And it's a way, again, the Soviets would say, hey, it's inculcating you against capitalist propaganda, so that if you did end up with a true fact in this massive static of unending propaganda, you would be unable to recognize it as such. It's sort of like every time I scroll through Instagram and I realize that there's so much, just a wild number of misinformation, and then randomly, occasionally, right? For me, it's like finance Instagram. The amount of crypto scams and multi-level marketing schemes and totally reckless and mathematically unsound investment strategies. And then randomly, you'll see one that's completely reasonable, reflects the best practices of the finance industry. And you're just like, and then you just keep scrolling and it's more propaganda. You will have no ability to discern that fact is true and the other facts are lies or scams.
Not until the forces of chaos appeared, showed themselves for what they were, the horrors they had become. And by that time, it was always too late. Far too late. So empty platitudes that rang false were issued to all and sundry. The War Master was a traitor and rebel. But they never stated why. Because who would believe them? How could they state to the populace they were asking to die in a war against immortals, that these titans had fallen to chaos, the dark gods now controlled them? After hundreds of years of conditioning, that anything outside of the Imperial Truth was to draw calumny, was to be risible and derided, if not worse punishment. It was not possible. But worse, what if they did tell them? What if the loyalists did convince the populace that Horus was now possessed by an evil spirit? It would have shown the Emperor to be either a liar or, probably worse, an incompetent.
Yeah, that would be... Think about how scary it would be if the material existence of God were to be proved and God were to pick a side. I mean, almost a God or a godlike being could not pick a side, because to stand in opposition to the power of the entire universe is ridiculous. No person would ever do it, right? A God could just delete every one of you from existence like that, right? So to admit that one of you is, one side does not have the backing of a God and the other side does, is actually making this choice really, really simple for everyone else. So you just sort of have to lie until they show up and demonstrate that they have the power of gods, and then you're in even worse shape.
Trap of the Imperial Truth. For how else do you explain his omniscience? For he was considered to be almost omniscient then. So how could he possibly have missed them? The dark gods of chaos. Way of the oncoming avalanche.
Alright.
To try to slow down the onward rush of the heretic fleets of Horus. Not to defeat them. Not to rise up and beat them. No. To throw the lives of the people of Vostroya into the way of a force they knew they could never stop. To sacrifice with no knowing if they would be lauded afterwards, or if a victorious and vengeful god in the form of Horus would then come back out into the galaxy, and once he had crushed the Emperor, to wreak bloody havoc on those who had resisted him.
Yep, this is, I think it's called Rococo's Basilisks. The idea that if there were an AI to rise, that AI would be hostile to everyone that didn't facilitate its rise or its delay in rising. Because if an AI believed it was a god and had perfect knowledge of all things, then by definition it would have achieved perfect goodness, right? Perfect knowledge of all consequence would entail being perfectly good and perfectly moral. You would be able to tease out the true moral truth of the universe. And so if such a thing were to exist, then by definition, opposing its existence in any way, shape, or form, or not speeding its existence as fast as possible, would be a moral bad, right? It would be the act of retreating from good, right? It would be the act of delaying perfect good from coming into the universe. So it stands to reason that if you believe Horus has godlike tendencies or has access to knowledge like a god might, that Horus will logically, of course, go back and impose its morality, the true perfect morality that can only come from the divine and from perfect knowledge. It's going to have to go and kill everything and everyone that ever opposed it, because by doing so, they showed that they are perfect moral bad. They are perfectly evil.
For there is also human nature in play as well. For is it not logical that the natural order of reality be that the son should outlive the father? That the torch would be passed down the generations? That it was highly likely that a figure as potent as Horus, with all of the force of the Crusade behind him, would be able to defeat the fewer forces that remained loyal to his old father. At this point, while Vostroya was deliberating, there are two myths about the next stage. Some of the lore states that Vostroya decided that it would be of more assistance to the Imperium if it simply continued to mine and work and churn out the resources of war that the Loyalists would need so badly. They reckoned that the message to the outlying systems such as theirs had been a frantic scream for aid, but had missed the nuances. That they would be doing a disservice to the Emperor and the Loyalist cause to stop what they were best at, producing materials of war, and instead take a large portion of their workforce and to throw them at the oncoming hordes of experienced soldiery that fought for Horus. Surely, arms were more important than a fleeting road bump that would cripple their ability to help, to produce. Another view on the situation is that they simply stood apart, would wait out the civil war and then plead forgiveness from its victor. That they could have provided men, but chose not to out of sheer pragmatism.
That does make sense.
On hindsight, this may seem inadvisable, but if we consider the times, the situation as I have outlined, then add in the influence of the cold logic of the Mechanicum, who had affected their culture and perspectives so much, then one can see that this is as strong a potential and probably more likely than the previous.
Though it does raise the question, if the Mechanicum is still closely tied to running this planet, why do they even have the authority to make their own decisions? They didn't get to decide what kind of world they were going to be. They didn't get to decide what they produced. Why are they deciding their own fate now?
Excuse that left them in such a positive light. The first feels more like a fable to defend their decision, something that was prepared for the meeting with Reboot Gilliman, and somehow became the official memory of the event. For in reality, few people or peoples will willingly admit their errors and shame. So the position of Vostroya was not so unfathomable.
I mean, their second logic may have actually worked, because Vostroya exists. They just field a regiment like every... Here's the thing, planets that didn't incur tremendous shame also are stuck fielding regiments all the time, so hard to really be like they got a bad, especially bad shtick, you know? They just got what every other planet got.
Not nearly as rare as current Imperial propaganda might state. It was a time of confusion, a time of war, a time of hate, a time of destruction, a time of heresy. And so, no men were raised, none were packed into transports and then sent across the void of space to simply stand in the path of the Juggernaut. But for Vostroya, this was not a wise decision. For against all the odds, the loyalists won. And they were not forgiving to those who they felt betrayed them at their moment of most need. So when the ruling body of Vostroya, the Tetrarchy, sent ambassadors to throw themselves on the mercy of the Emperor of Mankind, perhaps they were fortunate that he was not present, no longer able to take part in any proceedings. For he was struck down by Horus.
Yep, we know.
And would forever after be stuck on the throne on Terra, amongst his guards, hidden away for the rest of an eternity he had to endure. The new lord of the Imperium was effectively Reboot Gilliman, who stayed on Terra and placed a firm hand on the reins of the Imperium, while his remaining loyal brothers chased their traitor siblings and their legions across the stars.
Shout out to bearded Gulliman.
And into the Eye of Terror, in what is called the Scouring. And he, Reboot, passed the judgment that we heard at the beginning of the entry, the judgment that gave birth to the Vostroyan Firstborn. The true tragedy here is that the people of Vostroya do not even know what happened anymore. They remember that they had betrayed the Emperor. So much is left to motivate them to continue this endless drudge. But one must remember that this is the Imperium of man. Since the Horus Heresy, superstition and stupidity, regression, almost out of spite, has occurred. As the powers that be have decided, for good or evil, that the populace should...
I'm always curious about this, like, love of using shame on entire worlds, right? If there's one thing we know, it's that people don't take kindly to being shamed into things. National, large-scale shaming is a recipe for rebellion. People want to feel pride, they want honor, and they want to feel like they belong. So all of these things have the idea of an eternal, unwashable shame, and thinking that that will motivate someone, especially for tens of thousands of years, is pretty preposterous. Wouldn't really work, right? You'd be better off literally just creating a fiction in which your people were brave defenders of the Emperor and that they honor him now by, raising regiments, right?
Never truly know of chaos, the dark gods, demons, and what they did. History itself has been eradicated and falsified again and again by various elements within the Imperium for millennia on end. Hence none now remember that Horus turned to chaos. He is just a traitor, a boogeyman. Even on Vostroya itself, None are permitted to know the circumstances that drew down the curse of Gilliman on them.
Right, that doesn't make any sense. Like, imagine getting taught that in your history class. Like, you're all evil. We cannot tell you why exactly, but it happened 10,000 years ago, and therefore you are evil. And that, like, that's gonna motivate you to you're gonna lay down your life for an entity, a government that hates you, whose official stance is that you're evil? Like, that doesn't make any sense psychologically. No person's going to do that. If you're going to fight and die, why not fight and die for someone that likes you a little, right? God forbid you actually belong to that, right?
What they actually did wrong and why.
Though maybe that's how traditional armies fought. I don't know. Maybe that's how, like, Russia and stuff fought back in the Tsarist days. Like, the Tsar pretty clearly didn't like the average Russian, and yet they went out and fought.
That is left is the vaguest of myths and ongoing
But a lot of times they would fight for pay. Like there would be reward.
Cultural guilt that they are betrayers to their emperor.
I mean, that's probably the least realistic part about Warhammer 40k, is the idea that you can motivate people to, like, die en masse with nothing. Like, with no incentive, right? There's no, like, if you can survive 2 tours, you'll be a gajillionaire and you'll go back and you never have to work again, right? The bomber crew mentality, right? Where they said, oh, you just have to do 24 missions in a bomber, and you guys, you'll get to go home. It's the shortest tour in the whole war. Everybody else is stuck fighting for 4 years in the trenches, not realizing that statistically, there's almost no way a bomber crew is going to make it to 24 missions. Almost never happened.
And they sacrificed their firstborn sons to him, and have done for 10,000 years or more, just to attempt to remove this blemish. A blemish they
don't understand.
No longer even know how they gained. The world of Vostroyan. Located in the halo zone of the Segmentum Obscurus, it is further from Holy Terra, Earth, than the Eye of Terror, orbited by a single moon called Totolsky. Vostroyan is a minerally rich planet, even after such a duration of near-constant mining and processing, although I would wager the resources are certainly sent by surrounding planets to shore up this output. It is an industrial hub of prodigious production, and this has taken an effect on its landscape, as is so often true in the grim darkness of the future, for there is no consideration to sustainability or the greater weal. Hence there is now such climate devastation that much of the world is barren and harsh.
Nice.
Much of the world. Perhaps it is not in the league of an Astartes recruitment world, such as Fenris or Baal, but huge swathes of it are not hospitable. No agriculture of any sort occurs there due to this. Hence Vostroyan is on a steady supply of consumables from the greater sector surrounding it. Old derelict cities dot the zones that fall prey to the harshest of conditions.
Oh, okay. Runaway climate change. Happens to the best of us.
Here the Firstborn recruits are sent to train in the cold, bleak, barren sepulchres that were once so teeming with life. Urban settings, long uninhabited. Only in the equatorial belt is there any habitation outside of the hive cities. The world is divided into 7 managed zones, which administrate every hive and city and its production. It is a highly stratified and doggedly rigid society. One is born into a family of high or low birth, aristocracy, or tantamount to serfdom.
Yeah, it sounds like every other planet in the Imperium, honestly.
There is hardly any social movement, and this can only be found in rare occasions amongst the bravest low-born soldiers, who may just gain a position as a non-commissioned officer, a sergeant, etc. But the vast majority of all ranks, even outside of officer, are gained by those of higher social standing. For like a feudal aristocracy, it is in station that command is gained. But for the
I mean, if there's one thing that is sort of like the default, if humanity has a default hierarchy, it is definitely one like this. It's just in societies all over the world for the vast majority of recorded history, This is sort of how people self-organized, right? You were in your caste, your life was your life, and it had the advantage of not requiring any sort of educational infrastructure because a child could just observe their parent and would learn from observation how to conduct themselves and navigate the world. It has the advantage of being simple. It has the advantage of installing a hierarchy to enable things to run. But of course, it has the disadvantage of being utterly, totally stagnant. And because those with all the power have a vested interest in ensuring things never, ever, ever change, because you have to think, if you are on top, by definition, any change is a risk to you who sits atop the system. And when you sit atop it and you already have all the power and you have the ability to squash change, you will do so because all change is a potential threat.
Those who command on the field of battle cannot be those who take orders from their betters when off of it. Not for the Firstborn. Historically, this has invariably always led to incompetence, group overestimation of their own worth and talent, and the age-old saying of many a good army, lions led by donkeys. But the Firstborn somehow managed to remove this from the equation. Although command can only be gained by those who already possess high rank, the amount of candidates hailing from high strata means that there is plenty of room for maneuver.
I mean, listen, this. Okay, I'm going to go on one final rant, and then I got to call it because we're at 1 hour. I will say this. That system, it works, sort of. But one of the things that we've learned is that if you want, right, so let's assume that their officers, like modern officers, need to have a certain level of academic or theoretical thinking. And to achieve that, of course, in our current system, we say you have to go to college. Our officers in the military, in the U.S. military, are drawn exclusively from the ranks of those who've graduated from a 4-year university. And this is seen as giving them the appropriate amount of baseline ability to read, write, and think theoretically, to then learn and digest military tactics. But you have to think, we know that getting to college requires, of course, requisite study, requisite coursework. So you have to go and you have to be able to be college ready, is sometimes the phrasing we talk about now. And what does that mean to be college ready? Well, that means that, of course, you have to have done well in high school, which means you have to have been basically either born or had your parents move to an area with a very good public schooling system. But more than that, we know that you have to have an appropriate amount of support at home. You have to have a certain level of resources, right, in order to thrive. So this system, while it sounds sort of, we would never do that, in many ways that we do, right? The statistics are clear that while our officers, but certainly our generals, if you looked at the population that goes to, say, the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, you would see that West Point recruits are more likely than anyone else to come from families that are wealthier, families that value education more, but it basically draws from, if there could be such a thing as an American aristocracy, they are more likely to draw from it. The classic one is there are some high schools that place more people at military service academies or at Ivy League schools than entire states. Right? That is, of course, a troubling statistic, but it says that this method of selecting officers from those who already possess higher resources isn't as ridiculous as we might think. It still is sort of ridiculous, and again, a fairer system would ensure that all young children are born with access and the abilities to grow to their full potential, but no system has figured out how to do that, and you can see in the statistics for income inequality that in the U.S. we are not even close to that, right? Sometimes it seems like we're not even trying that hard. But all that, this is a really interesting look at the Vostroyan Firstborn, of course, one of the storied regiments of Warhammer 40k, And yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you to the members who recommended this video. As you can see, we're only part of the way through, but we are going to do our absolute damnedest to finish this out, right? We may have to set it up as a series of Friday videos, right? I've noticed this with a number where I'm going to have to spend a couple of Fridays working through these longer videos, but I enjoy them. They're interesting, and absolutely I will get it done because I'm a man of my word, if nothing else. So thank you so much for watching. Oh, be sure to, of course, check out the merch store. Check out the Discord, right? The Discord is free. And, oh, yeah, check out the podcast. You can check to see I've updated what used to be the MMA podcast is now more of a general purpose podcast, and it gives me a chance to go deeper into areas and topics that I want to talk about that don't necessarily have a baseline YouTube video to spin off of. Okay, guys, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time.